We will be continuing our journey this morning in 1 Samuel, and I'll be reading the entire chapter 21, and we'll go through the first 5 verses of chapter 22. So starting in verse 1, now David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found." And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women." Then David answered the priest and said to him, "Truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in the effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread which had been taken out before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, "Is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." So the priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, take it, for there is no other except that one here." And David said, "There is none like it, give it to me." Then David arose and fled that day from before King Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, 'Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his 10,000s?'" Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them. And there were about 400 men with him. Then David went up from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me." So he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Now the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you bless the reading of your word this morning, and I also pray blessings on those who have heard it today. I ask that you inspire Pastor Chris as he comes to teach from your word today, and I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
You can be seated this morning. It's a common phrase, and I'm sure you've heard it and have felt it before. It says that desperate times call for desperate measures. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and I had one of those times when I was in college. My wife and I had just been married a couple of months, and it's coming to winter season in northwest Indiana, so it was blustery and cold, and we didn't have much money, as most people don't, and I was in college and didn't have a ton of money in college, and so one day I'm driving my truck and park it in the parking lot of our apartment complex, and the next morning I go to start it, and when you know it, my little Ford Ranger won't start. Doesn't start at all. And so I try to figure it out. And I am no mechanic, mind you that. I am no mechanic. This is like pre-YouTube days. So I'm trying to figure out what this is on my own, And so I finally figure out it's the starter. Well, I've never replaced a starter in a vehicle in my life. That is not my skill set. Yet I am determined to do it myself because I have no money. I would have gladly, taken it to a mechanic and had him put in a starter for me, but I had no money. And so it's like, all right, here I go. So instead of watching YouTube and trying to figure out how to put that thing in, here is this guy getting the old Chilton's manual out, and leafing through the pages and figuring, all right, starter for a 19, whatever it was, Ford Ranger, as an automatic or a stick shift. So there I am. And so I go out to the parking lot, and I jack up the truck, and I don't have a quality jack. It's the one that comes with the vehicle, one that they should tell you should not use in order to lift up a car and work on it. But yet, what am I going to do? I've got no money. This is what I have to do. Desperate times, right? So I jack the car up, and so I get underneath, and you can imagine the quality of my tools at the time as well. I mean, Harbor Freight sounded really good at the time. That was the quality of my tools. And so I get underneath there, armed with my Chilton's manual and my cheap tools under a cheap jack in the middle of northwest Indiana winter. And I am not making this up. You can ask my wife. She doesn't lie. Sometimes I bend the truth. She doesn't. It was -6 degrees outside in this apartment parking lot. There is no barrier for me. I am out in the parking lot underneath this car. And so you know how it is when you're cold. Your hands are dry and it hurts and everything's painful. The bolts are even tighter than normal. And I didn't have a torch in which to soften them. And I've got these cheap tools and I'm trying to turn these things. And it's probably a good thing I didn't have a torch. That would not have gone well, but I would have tried to use it because I was young and ignorant. And so anyways, long story, even longer, short, I actually did get to fix it. I did fix it. It was not a good day. I remember it, and I was very angry, but I fixed it because I had to do what I had to do. Why? Because desperate times called for desperate measures. I had no other option. If I needed to get to work, I had to fix my vehicle, and I had to be to work that night. It's not like I could have skipped. And so desperate times called for desperate measures, and that's where David is in this story. David is in what we would consider to be a very desperate time. David is entering into a desperate season of life. So our title of the sermon today is called Grace in Desperation. David's in the days of desperation. And chapter 21 begins a 10-year wandering period for David. For 10 years, David is wandering the countryside, fleeing for his life. And this is where it all begins here in chapter 21. And he goes to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech asks him a really good question. He's like, why are you alone, and why is no one with you? And I'm sure David had to pause for a moment, and he had to think the same thing. He's like, yeah, what am I doing here? Why is there no one with me? Why is nobody here? What in the world am I doing here? And reflecting back on what David was doing here, David's like, look, I'm sure he didn't say this, but let's think about it for a moment. Like, I was just in a field a few years ago watching some sheep, just the youngest brother of my family, the forgotten child, the runt one, so to speak, and just watching sheep, and a guy came and said, hey, there's a guy named Samuel that wants to talk to you, come to dinner. So I came to dinner. The next thing you know, I'm anointed the next king of Israel. Then I'm kicked back out to the sheep for a while, and then I go to see my brothers at war, and there's this really tall guy out there saying some pretty bad words about God's people, and so I get upset about that, and I want to defend that, and I'm the only one that was willing to do it, and so I threw a rock at the guy, and what do you know, I killed him, chopped off his head, and the next thing you know, the king is keeping me here in his palace to be his own servant. And I'm the king's servant for a while, and he sends me out to battle, and I behave myself really wisely, and I start rising up in the ranks of Israel's army. I become a commander in Israel's army, but all the while, I didn't realize what David was thinking, but all the while, the king was hating me, and it was against me, and he was jealous of me, and he was going to try to kill me. And one day, I'm in the palace playing some music for him to calm him down, and he throws a spear at me, And he did it again, and then, so I'm like, I don't know what's happening. And the next day, he's like, hey, would you like to marry my daughter? Okay, I'll marry your daughter. Good. So David marries the daughter of King Saul and goes out and keeps going to war, and he's fighting, and he's doing well, and he's getting great victories for King Saul. And then King Saul gets jealous of him again, throws another spear at him. So David has to flee. He goes home, and Saul sends his people to David's house to kill Saul in his very own house, and his wife helps David escape out of his very own house. David flees to Samuel. Saul chases him there, is not able to get him there, and then where we last left off, David found out that Saul was definitely trying to kill him, definitely seeking his life, and he parted ways with his best friend Jonathan there in the field, and David ran, and this is where David ran to. I'm sure he's thinking at this same time, like, yeah, why don't I have anybody, God? Why am I even here? Days of difficulty in David's life took him to a time and a season of desperation. David has no job. He has no weapons. He has no changes of clothes. He has no food. He has no army. He really has no country because he is enemy number one. He has no friend. He just left his best friend, Jonathan. He has no Samuel. He can't go to Samuel and ask him anything because Saul is watching. He has no allies. He has no hope for the future. He has no plan for his future. He is in survival mode. He is living moment to moment, day to day, place to place, almost like Jason Bourne when he wakes up from his amnesia, right? That's kind of how I figure this guy David here. And the truth of the matter is that we will all go through days and seasons like this. Maybe not where we're being chased within an inch of our life, but days and seasons where we are in a desperate mode, where we have situations in life where we are wondering, how did I even get here? We're all going to go through times of survival mode where we feel trapped. We feel like there's no way out, like there's no hope, like there's no way to get out of the situation that you're in. And mind you that this David's situation, this was no fault of his. You notice that? All that it says about David up to this point is that he behaved himself wisely. David, in no way, shape, or form, deserved this kind of treatment, and yet he finds himself in days of desperation. This was not for sins of David that he was here. This is not for dumb decisions that he made or life choices. None of this was his fault. And sometimes we're going to find ourselves in situations the same. Not because of anything that we've done, but because of the sin that reigns within humanity and reigns within this world. Because of the fall of mankind, we find ourselves in difficult places of rough marriages. Our marriages struggle because we're two sinful people living together and we're fighting and arguing and sin reigns in there and we struggle for a while and now you're at a moment of desperation in your marriage and you don't feel any hope or anything like that. We're going to go through these financially. We're going to go through emotional seasons of desperation where we're at the point of a nervous breakdown. Where you get to the point like, I don't know if I can handle one more piece of bad news or one more bad thought right now. I'm at the point of a nervous breakdown. Physically, we're going to have times of desperation where we don't feel well, and that feeling of poor health leads to a diagnosis and words that we never wanted to hear, and now we're wondering, what am I going to do? I have no hope, I have no way out, or there's going to be times and seasons of desperation, of depression. Seasons of deep depression in our lives where we are so weighed under by things that are going on and circumstances in our life that there is no hope and you don't even want to start looking for hope because it feels comfortable in the depression and you keep sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into that solace and into that solitude and it's so thick that it has you paralyzed that you can't see anything else but the depression that is in your life. These are times of desperation. And we get to the point when there are decisions that have to be made, and yet we feel overwhelmed and unable to make the decisions, and yet you have to make the decision. And David is at that point in his life. I've got to make decisions, and I don't know what decisions to make. He's at a place of desperation. And let's see how David responds to this desperation. And we're going to look at that today. But more importantly, not just how David responds, but really the focal point of today's lesson is to focus on God's responses during David's time of desperation. The beautiful picture here, and the thing that just came to light in my mind and in my heart and in my spirit this week was, as I was reading through this, was not the things that David did, but seeing God in His grace overwhelming every situation in David's desperate times. And so let's look at that this morning. First, you'll see in your notes that we're going to discover God's grace during desperate days. David makes 4 stops at 4 locations, and we're going to look at each one of those locations. And each location shows us a different perspective, a different provision of God's grace in David's life. We'll get to see God's grace at work in different ways during times of desperation. The first place David goes to is Nob. David goes to Nob, and David runs to Ahimelech the priest. And that's a good place to run to, by the way. And understand that we're not talking about a pastor here. We're talking about our high priest in a sense. When you are in a day of desperation, the first place that you should run to is not to a pastor or to a person, but to our high priest, Jesus. David runs to Ahimelech the priest. Where else is he going to go? He goes to Nob. In verse 1 of chapter 21, it says, "Now David came to Nob and Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, 'Why are you alone, and why is no one with you?'" David has been presented a couple of questions here, and it's like, why are you by yourself? Typically, David, as the commander, one of the higher commanders in Saul's army, would not be alone. He would have an army with him. He would have men with him to protect him, right? Him being alone was not a smart thing. Or he'd have his family. He has neither. Ahimelech asked him the question, verse 2. So David answered and said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business, and said to me, 'Don't let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place.'" Now let's just pause for a moment and realize that David is not a saint. It's not perfect. Is David telling the truth here? Like, let's look at it. No. Let's be real honest here. David is not telling the truth. The king did not send him on a secret mission. The king's trying to kill him, right? He didn't send him on a secret mission. He didn't send his men to such and such a place. No, he is running for his life. David has told a lie. He's lying here. So that brings up the question, is it okay to lie in certain situations? Is moral relativism something that we should consider? Is my morality relative to the situation? Was it okay for David to lie here? Boy, I wish the scriptures would have gone on more and more right here and explained all of this out and reasoned that out for us, but it doesn't. It just leaves it there for us. It's like, here, deal with it. Why? Because it's not the point of the story. It's not the focal point of this story here. You wonder, and I've heard many commentators say that maybe he was going on a errand for the king, right? Capital K, king for God. Maybe that's what he meant, and that's not it. That's not what David meant there. And I've heard some people say maybe he lied to protect Ahimelech, and that could be very true. Maybe that he did lie to protect Ahimelech. Maybe he didn't want Ahimelech to know that he was running from Saul, and if Ahimelech knew that, then he would be in trouble himself. He was trying to protect him, or maybe he was just trying to protect himself. I don't know what was going through David's mind, and neither do you, but the point of the matter is here, he lied. He lied. And so, verse 3, let's move on. "Now, therefore, what have you on hand?" David says. "Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found." And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept at least themselves from women." Then David answered the priest and said to him, "Truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is, in effect, common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the show bread, which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. So David asks for bread, but there is no common bread there. There's only show bread there. Now, what you need to understand about show bread right now, and we're going to get to it more in detail in a moment, but show bread was not meant for the common man. It was meant for the priests to eat after it had been taken off the table of the Lord. It's not meant for him, but it's for priests. So David, get this, let's put this together. David lies. He tells a half-truth at least. He lies. And he is given bread he does not deserve. He is given bread that was not made for him. And you say, wait a second, why was David given a provision that he did not deserve? David just lied, and yet God provided for him. How could God, you have to ask ourselves, how could God reward David in this situation? How could God reward a sinful behavior? And before we go all like Justice League on this and think like all self-righteous on this, and David, you lied, you don't deserve this bread, can I ask us this question? How many of us deserve God's provision? Before we get all mad at David and say, you lied, you shouldn't have got this bread, well, can I ask you, like, do you deserve God's provision and grace? Do I deserve God's provision and grace? No. No, I don't. And so you see the point and the big picture here is, and you'll see this in your notes, that God's grace is greater than our sins. God's grace is greater than our sin. That's the big picture here. And so I want to, for a moment, as we think about this message that God is giving us here in this story, I want us to delve deeper into this picture, the picture of the showbread. And I want you to see something that was so cool this week in my study. I want to share it with you. So showbread is an interesting bread. It is a lasting bread. This bread was made specifically by a specific family for a purpose. It was put onto a table of the Lord, and it was a lasting bread. They had to make it in such a specific way that it did not mold or rot because it was going to be laid out in the open air for 7 days on a table. And so it was made to last a long time without getting moldy, without getting rotten, without getting stale. It was a lasting bread. And it was laid before God. There was a table in the tabernacle. It's called the table of the Lord. And this bread was laid upon this table, 6 stacks on one side, 6 stacks on the other side for the 12 tribes of Israel. And that bread would sit there on the table of the Lord, laid out for the whole week until the next week at Shabbat when the other bread would be put on there. This was priestly bread. This bread was intended, once it was off the table, to be consumed by the priests who did the serving. It was priestly bread. This bread was to be unleavened as well, meaning no leaven in it, and much like all their bread would have been, unleavened. And they had to bake it in such a way, they had to do it so fast that it didn't produce anything in it. It was really interesting. And the purpose of the bread is the really cool part. The purpose of this bread was to remind God's people, to be a continual reminder in the tabernacle for everybody, to remind God's people of His love and His provision for them. It said that as people would walk around and walk in and see the bread, that the priest would say, and they would show them the bread, and they would say, do you see how loved and how beloved you are? That's what they would say. They say, you see this bread? This is a sign of God's love for you. And they would show them that. And so David would come in that day and he would see that bread and he would receive that bread, and it would be like, David, even though you don't deserve it, do you see God's belovedness for you? Even though you just lied, I'm going to provide for you. Do you see how loved you are by God? And what a picture this is of what we have been given in the gospel. Can I relate this to us for a moment? Jesus is our showbread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Jesus also said, He said, this bread, this is my body, which is given for you, which is broken for you. I want you to do this in remembrance of me. Jesus is our showbread. And it's a priestly bread, Jesus is. Jesus is our high priest. And I want you to see this. He's our high priest. And this is an unleavened. This bread was unleavened. And Jesus was without sin. Jesus was perfect, never sinned. And Jesus also laid down His life before God. Just like the bread was laid on the table, Jesus was laid on the cross before God for God to see. And when we see it, and when we see Jesus on the cross, we say, look at how beloved we are by God. And can I say, this is not just lasting bread like the showbread was. This is everlasting bread. Jesus is for eternity. And when we take Jesus and we consume Him, so to speak, we invite Him into our life, we receive everlasting life. And when we see it, we know that we don't deserve God's love and God's provision and God's grace, and yet we receive it. And He gives it to us. The same as the priest gave David the bread, God says, I want you to have the bread of life. I want you to have Jesus, even though you don't deserve it, even though you are a sinner, even though if you couldn't earn this at all, I want to give it to you in your sin because I love you. Do you see how loved you are by God your Father? And this grace that saves us, can I say it also sustains us? This grace is not a one-time deal. This grace that David received there in that showbread, even though he didn't deserve it, wasn't a one-time thing. Can I say this bread sustained David for a long time, longer than just one meal. He asked for 5 loaves. Now understand this. The showbread weighed anywhere from 5 pounds to 11 pounds each loaf. So David's walking out of there with anywhere from 25 to 50 pounds of bread that he's carrying with him. That sustained David for many days on his march, many days as he was fleeing. And the grace that God gives us is not just for salvation. It's not just something that we get when we come into the door of Christianity and God says, now I need you to deal with life on your own. No, this grace is not just saving, it's sustaining. Because guess what? We're going to mess up every day. We're going to sin every day, and every day we don't deserve the grace of God, but God continues to give us grace for every day as we're in days of desperation. And we're going to mess up in days of desperation, in days when you're struggling, in days when you're down, in days where you're going through and you can't see anything clearly. Guess what? You're going to sin, and God's going to say, guess what, son? I still love you. Guess what, daughter? My grace is still here for you in the difficult days, and in the times when you mess up, my grace does not leave you in those days. My grace is here to sustain you in those days. And know that as you walk through desperate days, the grace of God is sustaining you even when you sin. Now, I am not minimizing sin. I am not saying it's okay to sin. God's grace will cover it. That's not what I'm saying at all. I am not minimizing sin. What I'm doing is elevating the power of God's grace. Can you see how amazing God's grace is that is given to you as you don't deserve it? David experienced that day at Nob. David also received Goliath's sword, and that's going to be important here as we move to our next place as David goes to Gath. David here at Gath, verse 10. And David rose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. This is interesting here. This is an interesting turn in David's thinking, and what is he thinking? It shows you how desperate he really was. He's like, man, I got nowhere to go. Where can I go? Let's go to the city of that guy, that most famous guy that I killed, Goliath. Let's go to his hometown, and let's go talk to his king. Let's go to the sworn enemy of Israel, and maybe I can find some shelter and some comfort there in the hometown of my enemy. David goes there, and he made a pretty dumb decision if you really stop and think about it. Like, let's just be real honest and clear about this. This was not the best move on David's part. Have you ever made a decision, and maybe it's just me, ever made a decision and you were like, what? And you look back at it later, like, what was I thinking? Like, that was a really dumb move. Like, I don't know what I was thinking in the moment, but man, that was a dumb move. What was I thinking? I had a couple of those moments in my life. I won't share with you all of them because we'd be here a while. But I can remember one time, I was probably, 10 years old or so. I was hanging out with a pastor's kid, so you know it's going to go wrong from there. Hanging out with a pastor's kid, and we're hanging out at his house, and he had a park down the road, and so we go down the road and start hanging out in the park, just he and I. And man, you know how it is. Like, you're at that age where you're allowed to be away from your parents, and it's kind of cool, and you feel like, man, I'm the man, So we do some really dumb things, and then we do some even more dumb things, which I'm going to explain to you what I did here in a moment. We go into the woods, and we had matches. And so, if you got matches, what are you going to do? You're going to burn stuff, right? Burning stuff is cool. You don't really understand, it could cause a lot of problems. So we start collecting everything we can possibly think of to collect within the woods, and sticks and leaves, and we make this, massive bonfire pile within the woods. Kids, do not do this. Young people, do not do this. It's not bright. And so we make this huge, huge pile. Taller than me, of just leaves and stuff, and so we light it on fire, not thinking it'll catch. Well, it caught. And that whole thing goes up, and next thing you know, we're looking at a fire that's like as tall as this church in here. And we're a couple of 10-year-olds looking at this massive fire, looking all around us like, there's trees everywhere. This is a neighborhood. This could go really, really, really bad. And I look back at that now, and I was like, what was I thinking? Like, that was a dumb, dumb move. It was cool at the time, but it was a really dumb move. If we'd had smartphones, I would show you pictures, but a dumb move. David here is kind of making that move. What would make David think it was a good idea to go to Gath? Maybe they'll accept me as a defecting commander in Saul's army. Maybe I can give them some input. But think about that for a moment. If that was his line of thinking, like, he is walking over to the sworn enemy of God. He's walking over to these people who are trying to kill them. Like, that was not really good. He is aligning himself with God's enemy. Like, also, did you not think that the widows and the brothers and the sisters and the fathers and the mothers of the people that he had killed would not know who he was? I mean, like, stop for a moment, David. You killed a lot of these people, right? Just a chapter ago, you went and killed 200 of them just to be able to marry your wife, right? Do you not think that they would remember who you are? And they did remember. Verse 11, and the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands? They remembered who he was. So what did David do in that moment? Let me go back to the fire in that moment. Sometimes when we make dumb decisions, how do we respond? Well, there we are. Me and my friend John were at this fire, and we're looking at it. And what did we do? Well, we didn't have cell phones at the time. They weren't invented. So what did we do? Well, we did what everyone would have done at that time, every responsible person. We just ran. We ran. Like, we just started running, and we ran home, and we didn't tell a single soul about it. And we sat there in his room, and we were watching over the park. His house was a few places down from the park, and we're watching here to make sure, like, we start listening for fire engines and all kinds of stuff, and, you know, an hour goes to 2 to 3, and we finally realized that we were okay. I think we're okay. Statute of limitations is up either way, so I think we're okay. But what did David do when he realized he had made a dumb decision? He acted like he was crazy. Verse 12, now David took these words to heart. Like, he was like, oh, man, not a good call. And he was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I needed this madman? That you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? David acts like he's insane, right? But my question then is this, like, it's not about David playing mad. That was kind of a smart idea. But how did David escape that? Notice it said that he was in their hands, right? It says that he was in their hands. They had him in custody. How did David escape that? Like, why did the people from Gath, why did Achish let him go? First, if they actually thought it was David, which I think they did think it was David, but he was just maybe gone crazy, a little PTSD maybe. I'm not denying that, but it's probably true. Like, they probably thought maybe he is just gone off his rocker. They still probably would have killed him, right? Like, this is the guy who killed a lot of people in your hometown. Like, we're going to exact vengeance on him. So if they thought it was David, I think they would have killed him anyways, right? Or they could have thought, like, this guy could probably be a spy coming in here to figure out what's going on. We should probably kill him because he could be very well a spy. Or if they didn't think he was a spy, they didn't think it was David, but they knew it was an Israelite. Israel was their sworn enemy. They've got this guy in their grasp who is of fighting age. I mean, they've killed a lot of Israelites up to that point. Why wouldn't they have just killed him? So what I want to see here is there is safety and provision that is outside of David's hands that has been given to him there. Can I say this, and you'll find this in your notes, that God's grace is greater than our bad decisions. We can see this here in this life. God's grace is greater than our bad decisions. Gath was a shaky decision, and yet God protects David through this decision. In days of desperation and in times of our life, we will not always make the right choice. You are going to have, and I am going to have, bonehead decisions. And yet we can look at this and realize that the grace of God is greater than our bad decisions, and it will sustain us through our bad decisions. We're going to make bad financial decisions, bad work decisions, relationship decisions, marriage and parenting and personal and spiritual decisions. We are going to go through times where we make bad decisions, but can I say, rest assured that God's grace is protecting you and guiding you and is with you and is able to redeem our bad decisions. God will take our bad decisions and redeem them for good down the way. And I'm sure you're like me. If you think back over your life, think back over the past 10 or 20 years or 30 years or whatever, and you start thinking of things that you have done that you should have been in trouble for, one, or hurt for, two, or anything like that. You start to look at the grace of God that was sustaining you through a lot of bad decisions in your life and know that His grace is greater than any bad decision we will ever make. So David now at this point is wondering, where do I go from here? I've tried this problem out, so I'm just going to run. I heard about this secret cave hideout in Adullam. Maybe this was a place they used to hang out as kids. I don't know. So next we see David at Adullam, the cave in Adullam. Chapter 22, verse 1, David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave at Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. David flees from Gath and lands about 12 miles east to a cave just outside of Judah, just a little cave, and he's just there by himself. His desperation has caused him to sin and caused him to make a bad decision, and now he is at one of the lowest points in his life. He's all by himself. He's out of ideas, out of places to run. He's at the end of his rope, so to speak. He's just hanging on. He's out of ideas. He has no idea what's going to happen to him, and yet the grace that has sustained him thus far will continue to sustain him even when he doesn't know how. But we get to see how God sustains David in this time of deep depression and desperation. Look at the rest of look at verse 2. And everyone who's in distress, everyone who is in debt, everyone who is discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. David at Adullam, what do we learn about God's grace here? That God's grace is expressed through the people he places around us. God's grace is expressed, or it's manifested to us. God gives us grace via people that he places around us. God sends people to David that are in need of help. It's not the best of society either. You notice the list there. This is not the best of society. This is the broken of society. These are the ones who are not winning at life right now. These are the ones who are in debt. These are the ones who are struggling. These are the ones who are depressed. These are the ones who are down. These are the disgruntled of society. They all just kind of leave and go to this cave where David is. And David is at the deepest part of his life in depression. And here comes all these people who are in the same boat as him. You think, like, why would God send people to David like this? It doesn't make any sense in our minds. This is the last thing he needed. He has his own problems. But these people that seemed like problems or inconveniences were actually manifestations of God's grace. Because in serving them, David got his eyes off of himself and off of his own problems and started to invest in other people around him. God was trying to show David, like, David, you're not the only one struggling. And I've got you, but I need you to help me with some other people. And so I want you to get your eyes off of yourself in this moment of desperation, in this season of despair. I want you to get your eyes off of yourself and see the needs of other people and start pouring into other people that I'm bringing to you. So in serving them, David got his eyes off of himself and on his own problems. But in them, in these people, note this and mind this, in them, in these 400 that God sent to David, David found a family to go to war with. David found a family of people to protect him, to encourage him, and to serve him. David, think about it, was armyless at this time. And yet he knew one day he was going to be the king of Israel because God has told him he would, but he was armyless. He was by himself. He was alone. He had no crew with him. He was being chased by all of Israel's forces and the king himself. And these 400 men became the backbone of David's army. These 400 men became David's strong men. These became David's mighty men. And we read about their deeds in the next couple of books. These men became David's army. These men became the ones that protected David and served David and helped David and walked through all of this stuff with David. God was not only just saying, hey, I need you to serve them, but God was saying, hey, they're going to serve you and help you as well. I am providing for you in people. So my question to us is this: how do you see the people that God has placed around you? Do you see them as problems and inconveniences? Or do you see them as manifestations of God's grace? God has strategically placed people beside you in your neighborhoods, in your office, at your workplace, in the pews around you. God is bringing people into your lives, and it might be disguised as messy and as broken and as discouraged and as hurting, but God is saying, I'm bringing these people around you as manifestations of my grace for you. For you. How do you see them? This is what church is. Can I just park here for a quick moment? This is what church is. This is a group of people that come together all in need. Every single one of us are in need. And every single one of us are going through things. And God says, I want you to come together so you can serve one another and help one another. The person in the pew in front of you and behind you and next to you and across the room, God has put into your life strategically and for specific purposes. And their life might be messy right now. And God says, I want you to get your eyes off yourself and I want you to go and serve them. But He's also saying, hey, guess what? Someday your life's going to be messy and they're going to be there to serve you as well and to help you as well. And God has given this, each and every one of us, this body of people together. And yet we don't even know each other's names so many times. We're like saying, God, I love your grace and I thank you for your grace and I thank you for giving it to me. But I want to reject this part of your grace. I don't need people in my life. I'm self-sustaining. God says that's not true at all. God says, I'm giving you people that are there to help you, and you are forfeiting God's grace when you say, I'm not going to connect with people and get and help people and let people help me. Go ahead, and God says, I've given you people around you to help you. Take your eyes off yourself for a moment and take your eyes off your own comfortable situations for a moment, and would you reach out and help somebody? Would you reach out and ask somebody their name? Would you reach out and ask somebody, how can I pray for you? Or would you reach out to somebody and say, could you pray for me? I know that God has put you in my life so you can pray for me. Will you pray for me? Man, that's what the church is. We're here to help each other and to encourage each other. We're manifestations of God's grace to one another, but do we ever tap into that resource? If not, we're neglecting it. We're neglecting the grace of God that's sitting around us. And so you can see in days of desperation, God gave him people to serve him and also for him to serve. And in days of desperation, can I say, keep your head up to see who God is bringing your way. When you are at the lowest of the low, can I say, look around and see who God brings your way. This is what God was doing to David, and this is what God does to us. Look around. Who's God bringing into your life? You're like, why is this person in my life right now? Because that is God bringing somebody into your life for you to help, and so that that person can help you as well. Take God up on that offer. Even if it gets messy, even if it gets inconvenient, even if it gets a little bit discouraging at times. I'm sure these men were discouraging, and it was more work for David. Now he had 401 mouths to feed instead of one. But take time, even if it gets messy, to see the grace of God that he's bringing around you in people. Lastly, we go here to David at Moab. David leaves the place there. His family actually came to him. You'll see back in in verse 1, his family comes to him, and David goes to Moab, which is really interesting. Look at verses 3 and 4. It says, then David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come here with you, so I know what God will do for me. You see, his family had come to him. His dad and his mom, I'm sure some of his siblings had come to him. Verse 4, so he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. You see, David's family knew it wasn't safe for them either in Israel. So they flee, and they go to where David is, and David's like, you guys can't live here in the cave with these guys, right? That's rough. That's some rough living. I'm sure the aroma was potent, right? And so here's his family. He's like, what am I going to do with my parents? I have to take care of them. That's my duty. And so he thinks of this place in Moab. Now, what made David think of Moab now when he wouldn't have thought of Moab earlier? Like all of a sudden, oh, Moab, yeah, I'll take my parents there. Why didn't David run to Moab instead of Gath? It's interesting, right? Well, David's dad was a man by the name of Jesse, right? And that man by the name of Jesse, and Jesse had a dad named Obed. Obed had a dad named Boaz. Now, who is Boaz, you ask? Well, Boaz, we meet Boaz's character a book before this in the book of Ruth. Boaz married this lady named Ruth. Now, who was Ruth? Ruth was a lady that wasn't supposed to marry Boaz in the first place. Ruth was a young lady from a country called Moab. Ruth was a Moabitess. She married an Israelite. That guy died. You know the story. And so she comes to Israel with her mother-in-law Naomi as a Moabite girl, and she is taken under the wing of this guy named Boaz. And Boaz ends up marrying Ruth. And Ruth, the Moabitess, has a son named Obed. Obed has a son named Jesse. Jesse has a son named David. So they had ties to Moab. They had family, so to speak, in Moab. David could talk about Or Jesse, his dad could talk about, I used to go to Moab and see my grandparents and great-grandparents and all of those things, and they had family there. So you say, what does that all have to do with David? Can I say this? God's grace is prepared in advance of our need. Can you see this here? God's grace is prepared in advance of our need. God had given David a place of refuge because of something that happened 100 years before. God was preparing a place for him. Before David knew he needed it, God's provision had already prepared a way for him. And can I say, God has already provided a solution for the problem you're facing. See that and realize that. God has already provided a solution for the situation that you are facing. You and I don't know it yet. We don't know, but God knows. God is outside of time. The solution to your problem has already been provided for by God. So what do? We just trust in God and walk through these things with God. But even greater than that and even bigger than the problem that we have now is that God has already provided for your greatest problem. The greatest problem that you and I will ever face has already been provided for. And what is our greatest problem? It's not your spouse, okay? It's not your in-laws. It's not your finances. What is your greatest problem? Your greatest problem is sin. Your greatest problem is sin. Why? Because it carries an eternal consequence. And God says, I know that you cannot provide for your own sin, and so I'm going to provide a way for you. And so 2,000 years ago, God sent His Son, Jesus, to die on the cross to pay the penalty for our sin. And the Bible says that while we were yet sinners, Romans 5:8, while we were still sinning, Christ came and died for us. He gave Himself for us. God prepared a provision to forgive our sins before we even knew about it. And that gives me confidence knowing that God is preparing a provision and has prepared a provision for the problem that I have now, even before I know about it. And so, as you're going through these days of desperation, as you're going through these days of despair and doubt and confusion and heartache and pain, have hope knowing that God already has a solution to this. And that if God would provide for your greatest need of sin, do you not think that He will provide for these lesser matters? I'm not trivializing the matters that we go through. I am showing you that God has already provided for the greatest need that we will ever have. So He'll provide for you even in this. It might not be the way you think, but it'll be the way that God has prepared, and it is perfect. So we can see that God, even in our difficult days, we can see the grace of God in them. So that leads us to this last question, this last point, and we'll fly through this. How do we respond in desperate days? What is our response? When we face these things, what can we learn, and how can we practically apply this to our lives? How do we respond in desperate days? Letter A, be reminded of God's abundant love and sustaining grace. In days of desperation, be reminded of God's abundant love and sustaining grace. We need to focus on this intentionally because oftentimes when we get into the muck and the mire of life, we don't look up, we just look down or we look in. We need to look up and be reminded of God's abundant grace and His abundant love in our lives. And we remind ourselves of that. Right? It's important. Even if you don't feel it. You might not even feel it. Even if you don't feel the abundant love and the grace of God in your life, you have to recognize that it's there and tell yourself that it's there. And don't lose hope because you are loved and you are beloved by God. We remind ourselves of God's abundant love and sustaining grace. Next, we're going to pour our hearts out to God. Pour your heart out to God. Just cry out to Him. Sing aloud to Him. Yell or whatever you got to do, just talk to Him and tell Him what you're thinking and tell Him what you're feeling and tell Him how you're hurting and tell Him how you're down and tell Him how you have no hope and just lay it all out there for God. Tell Him you're frustrated. That's okay. Tell Him you're angry. That's okay. Tell Him you're mad. That's all right. He knows. And even if your anger and your frustration and your animosity is aimed at Him, tell Him. Tell Him because He knows. Don't hold it in. Pour it out to God. And lastly, we're going to serve, and we're going to be served by those that God puts around you. God is giving you people that you can serve and that can serve you, but we have to take that step of faith out and realize that God has put them into our lives on purpose. Who is it that you're serving around you right now? It might just be your family. It might be your spouse. Might be a neighbor, but look outside of yourself for a moment and get your eyes off of the problems for a moment and see other people and start doing something for somebody else. And realize the grace of God in your life. And can I say that none of this is to say that your problem will be fixed by focusing on these things. I'm not saying if you do A, B, and C that your problem is magically going to go away. That's not true at all. I'd be lying to you. I'd be giving you false hope. Your problem might not ever go away. David's problem didn't go away. Think about it. David was still stuck there in the cave, and for 10 more years he'd be running around. He had no idea what was going on. Saul was still after his head. But can I say sometimes, listen, our greatest act of faith is just hanging on to God when all around us is unraveling. Sometimes that is the greatest show of your faith, is you just hold on tight to God while everything around you is swirling and chaotic, and you just hold on and say, God, I'm holding on to you. I don't know what's happened in the rest of my life, but I've got a hold of you, and I know that, and more than that, I know that you've got a hold of me. I'm just going to hang right in here in faith because I know that you have me, and I know that you're with me, and I know that you love me even though I don't feel it, and I know that your grace is sustaining me even though I don't see it, and I just hold on to that faith, God. I'm going to close a little bit differently this morning. As David was going through all of this, when he reached the cave of Adullam, he wrote this psalm. It's Psalm 142. I would encourage you to read it at some point and to see the mind and the heart of David. But I'd like for you just for a moment to close your eyes. And I'm going to read this, and we're going to pray this, so to speak, as a body of Christ. When you're going through the days of desperation, may this be your prayer. It says, I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord, I make my supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path and the way which I walk. They have secretly set out a snare for me. Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. Well, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me. God, I thank you for this time. I thank you for this word. I thank you for David just going through the difficult days, Lord, showing us that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to make bad decisions. We're going to come to the end of our rope, Lord, and thank you for showing us that your grace sustains us through all of this. And God, thank you for being a God who loves us so much that allows us to pour out our complaints before you, who listens to us when our cries come before you, Lord, and who is preparing provision for us even as we're in the days of desperation. And God, I pray that if there's any this morning, Lord, who are not your children, who this morning, Lord, have not given their hearts and their lives over to you to be their Lord and Savior, that they would do that this very morning. Lord, would you point that out in their heart? And Lord, may they know that they need to have forgiveness of sins. And Lord, may they reach out to you as Lord and Savior and ask you to save them this very moment. And Lord, help us, Lord, as we go through these days, Lord, to turn first and foremost to you and just to rest in your grace and your care. And in Jesus' name, amen.